Before we count how many times humanity nearly vanished, hit subscribe so you don't miss the rest of the Resident Evil lore deep dives. This is the complete timeline of every global extinction event that almost happened, from city-level outbreaks to world-ending bioweapons that were stopped only seconds before it was too late. Part 1, Progenitor Virus, humanity's first close call. The history of the modern world is a fragile illusion built upon a foundation of biological ignorance. To understand the true scale of the threat we face in 2026, one must first recognize that the human species nearly met its end in the 1960s, long before the world had ever heard the name umbrella. The discovery of the Progenitor Virus in the deep underground ruins of the Nipaya Kingdom was not merely a scientific breakthrough. It was the discovery of an extinction engine. This ancient pathogen, which lived within the stairway of the sunflower, was the first and most potent biological threat to the global population. Because the virus demanded an impossible one, in 10 million genetic compatibility for a successful bond, any uncontrolled release into a major population center during the late 20th century would have resulted in what Oswald Spencer called the Great Cool. This was not a weapon designed for war. It was a biological reset button. The iron reality of the Progenitor Virus was its absolute and uncompromising lethality toward the standard human genome. Early laboratory leaks in the 1960s and 70s, conducted in high security but ultimately fallible facilities, proved that without a vaccine, which did not exist at the time, humanity's first encounter with the virus would have been its last. The virus did not simply kill. It dismantled the host at a molecular level, causing total cellular breakdown in minutes. In a world before the global connectivity of the internet or the rapid response teams of the BSAA, a single localized outbreak could have spread like a wildfire through the air and water. The result would have been a planet populated by a handful of self-proclaimed gods who possessed the rare genetic markers to survive, and billions upon billions of liquefied corpses. This was the first close call where the arrogance of three men, Spencer, Marcus, and Ashford, nearly silenced the human heart forever. The sorrow of the progenitor era was the realization that the virus was a predator that had been waiting for millions of years to reclaim the Earth. The researchers who first handled the virus were so blinded by their own elitist visions of a new world that they failed to measure the volatility of the substance they were holding. They viewed the massive mortality rates not as a warning sign of extinction, but as a filter to remove the unworthy. This ideological madness meant that they took risks with containment that should have been unthinkable. If a single infected researcher had made it to a major transportation hub in the 1960s, the human story would have ended in a grotesque pile of necrotic sludge. We survived this first era not through tactical genius or medical intervention, but through the sheer luck of geographical isolation and the limited mobility of the era. The Progenitor Virus remains the silent father of every disaster that followed, a reminder that the world almost ended before the game had even truly begun. Furthermore, the Progenitor Virus proved that the human species is biologically obsolete when faced with raw evolutionary pressure. The 1960s were a time of great social and political change, but all of that would have been rendered meaningless by a pathogen that does not care about borders or ideologies. The virus was a clinical force of nature that aimed for total species replacement. Spencer's goal was never to improve humanity, but to replace it with a refined version of himself and his peers. This was a zero-sum game where the existing world had to die for the new one to be born. The early trials in Africa were the scale model for a global apocalypse where the Indipaya were the first to be discarded. we must look at the Progenitor Virus as the ultimate warning that was never heeded. A sign that once you unlock the door to forced evolution, you cannot close it again until everyone inside is dead. Part 2. Marcus's leech control incident. In the year 1998, the world faced a new and terrifying evolution of the biological threat during what is now known as the Ecliptic Express and Management Training Facility incident. This was not a random outbreak caused by human error or a simple leak. It was the first time an extinction event was guided by a vengeful and high-level intelligence. The resurrected James Marcus, utilizing the hive mind of his T-virus infected leeches, had achieved a state of biological unity that surpassed anything previously recorded. By using his control over the leeches to sabotage Umbrella's primary training facilities and the high-speed rail line, Marcus was not just seeking revenge. He was testing a new model for a global hive mind. This was a departure from the mindless zombies of the T-virus. For the first time, the virus itself could think, hide, and strategize through its parasitic hosts. The iron logic of the Marcus incident was the efficiency of the hive mind as a vector for infection. Had the leech colony managed to move beyond the isolated Arklay Mountains and reach the Raccoon City water supply prematurely, the world would have faced a disaster that traditional containment protocols could never have stopped. Unlike a standard viral spread, which follows predictable patterns of transmission, the Marcus leeches could move as a singular coordinated unit. They could infiltrate secure areas, navigate complex piping systems, and target specific individuals to dismantle the command and control structure of a city. The hive mind nature of the infection meant that the virus was not just a pathogen, but an army. This intelligence allowed the outbreak to adapt to the efforts of the STARS teams and the Umbrella security forces, proving that a thinking virus is a threat that no amount of fire or quarantine can truly erase. The sorrow of the 1998 incident was the realization that the human mind could be subverted and replaced by a parasitic collective. James Marcus himself had lost his humanity and had become a vessel for the Queen Leech, yet he retained his genius for biological warfare. This fusion of human intellect and viral aggression was a precursor to the global threats of Wesker and Sadler. The world came within hours of a total parasitic takeover. If Marcus had chosen to spread the leeches through the continental rail system, instead of focusing on his personal vendetta against Spencer, the outbreak would have been simultaneous and global. The leeches would have acted as silent sleepers within the infrastructure of modern society, waiting for the signal to strike. We were saved only by the narrow focus of a dead man's rage and the intervention of Rebecca Chambers and Billy Cohen, who managed to destroy the heart of the hive before it could expand. Furthermore, the Marcus incident proved that the environment itself could be weaponized against us. The leeches were able to thrive in the dark, damp corners of the industrial world, turning the very systems we built for our comfort into breeding grounds for our destruction. This was the first warning that the next extinction event would not come from the air, but from the shadows beneath our feet. The intelligence of the leeches allowed them to mimic human forms and lure in victims showing a level of predatory deception that zombies could never achieve. This incident was a close call that showed how fragile our control over the ecosystem truly is. When the virus can think, it no longer waits for us to make a mistake. It creates the mistake for us. James Marcus proved that the greatest threat to the world is not just a virus, but a man who has decided that the world is no longer worth saving. Part 3. Raccoon City, the containment failure. The 1998 Raccoon City disaster remains the most significant urban apocalypse in human history. representing the moment the world realized that a single city's collapse could trigger a global domino effect. While the public narrative focuses on the tragic loss of over 100,000 lives, the true horror lies in how close the containment efforts came to total failure. The decision to execute Operation Mission of Mercy, the nuclear sanitization of the city, was not an act of strength, but a desperate gamble by a government that had lost control of the situation. The iron reality of the Raccoon City incident was that the nuke did not guarantee safety. It was a crude attempt to bury a secret that had already begun to leak into the world. If the wind had shifted, or if the evacuation of key Umbrella personnel had been more successful, the T-virus would have moved past the blast zone before the missile ever hit the ground. The failure of the Raccoon City containment was multi-layered and systemic. Umbrella's monitor agents who were embedded within the city were specifically tasked with extracting biological samples and combat data during the height of the chaos. Several of these agents, along with infected wildlife such as birds and rats, managed to escape the quarantine perimeter in the days leading up to the nuclear strike. The sorrow of the city was that it was treated as a laboratory rather than a community, ensuring that the virus had every opportunity to adapt and spread before the military could intervene. We now know that the T-virus was detected in the surrounding forests and water systems weeks after the explosion, proving that a nuclear strike is a localized solution for a biological problem that knows no boundaries. The world nearly ended in 1998 because we believed that fire could stop a virus that had already learned how to travel. Furthermore, Raccoon City proved that the modern urban infrastructure is the perfect breeding ground for a global extinction event. The density of the population, the interconnectedness of the sewage and water systems, and the reliance on centralized emergency services meant that once the threshold of infection was reached, the city collapsed in less than 72 hours. This rapid decay showed that any metropolitan area in the world could be turned into a necropolis in a matter of days. The global economy and international travel were nearly brought to a standstill as the world watched the first live broadcast of a biological war. We were saved from a global outbreak only because the government was willing to commit an atrocity to save the many from the few, but even that sacrifice was almost insufficient. Raccoon City was the first domino, and it was only through a series of narrow interventions that the rest of the world did not fall with it. The incident also highlighted the incompetence and corruption of the institutions meant to protect us. The local police force was undermined by the chief of police, who was on the Umbrella payroll, and the military was hesitant to act until the situation was beyond repair. This institutional failure meant that the virus had a head start that it never should have had. Raccoon City was a warning that the greatest threat to human survival is not the virus itself, but the people who believe they can manage it for profit or power. The 1998 disaster was a close call that showed that the world is only as safe as its weakest link. We survived Raccoon City, but we lost our innocence, and we were left with the terrifying knowledge that the next city to fall might not be so easily contained. Part 4. The G-virus escape scenario. While the T-virus caused the immediate collapse of Raccoon City, the true extinction threat within the city was the G-virus created by William Birkin. The iron logic of the G-virus was that it was designed for unending and hyper-accelerated evolution. Unlike the T-virus, which eventually kills its host or results in a stable mutation, the G-virus seeks to constantly rewrite its own DNA to adapt to any threat. More importantly, the G-virus possessed a unique reproductive drive, where the host would attempt to implant embryos into other living beings to spread the infection. This was not a viral spread. It was a species replacement. If a G mutant, like the transformed William Birkin, had managed to reach the outskirts of Raccoon City and enter the local ecosystem, the world would have faced an unstoppable self-replicating nightmare that no nuclear strike could ever fully erase. The G virus escape scenario would have involved the virus moving from human hosts into the wildlife and the food chain. Because the G virus seeks to reproduce across species, a single infected animal in the Arklay Mountains could have triggered a continental collapse. The sorrow of the Birkin project was the realization that the virus was a living, predatory intelligence that viewed all other life as raw material for its own growth. If the G virus had reached a major agricultural hub, it would have contaminated the global food supply, turning every meal into a potential vector for mutation. This was a threat that could not be quarantined because it was designed to bypass every biological defense the human body possessed. We came within minutes of this reality when Birkin pursued his daughter Sherry through the underground labs. If he had reached the surface, the G virus would have become a permanent and evolving part of the Earth's biosphere. Furthermore, the G virus represented a threat to the very idea of genetic stability. The virus did not just kill the host, it turned the host into a chaotic and shifting mass of eyes and limbs that was constantly searching for a new form. This was the ultimate expression of the forced evolution Spencer had dreamed of, but without any of the aristocratic control. A world infected by the G virus would not be a world of gods. It would be a world of formless screaming monstrosities that would eventually consume themselves. The G virus was a biological black hole that would have sucked in all life on the planet until nothing was left but a single mass of mutated meat. We were saved only by the fact that the G virus requires a specific genetic match for successful implantation in its early stages, and by the destruction of the Birkin specimen before it could reach its final unstoppable form. The G virus escape was the nightmare scenario that the US government feared most. It was the primary reason for the decision to nuke Raccoon City, as they realized that the T virus was merely the distraction for a much more potent threat. The G virus proved that once you unlock the ability for a virus to reproduce and evolve independently, you have created a weapon that is superior to its creator in every way. It was a close call that showed how close we came to losing our physical identity as a species. The G virus remains the most terrifying what-if in the history of Umbrella. A reminder that the world didn't just almost end in 1998. It almost changed into something that should never have existed. Part 5. Umbrella's Arctic facility collapse. The collapse of the Antarctic transport terminal during the events involving Claire Redfield and the Ashford twins represented a global extinction threat that was almost entirely hidden from the public eye. The threat here was the T. veronica virus, a pathogen that combined the progenitor legacy with the DNA of a queen ant to create a hive mind-controlled ecosystem. Because the virus was designed to thrive in extreme temperatures and utilize insect-based mentalities, its release into the global currents from the Antarctic would have been catastrophic. The iron reality of the T. veronica threat was that it aimed for a total ecological takeover, where the Earth's biosphere would be turned into a singular interconnected colony under the control of a queen host. This would have meant the literal end of human autonomy, as the entire planet was restructured into a hive. The failure of the Antarctic containment would have allowed the T. veronica virus to enter the Southern Ocean. From there, the global currents would have carried the viral strands to every continent on Earth. Unlike the localized zombies of Raccoon City, The T. veronica infection would have manifested as a rapid and coordinated transformation of the local flora and fauna. The sorrow of the Ashford project was the cold beauty of the destruction it sought to cause. Alexia Ashford viewed the world as an anthill, and herself as the only individual with any true agency. If she had succeeded in releasing the virus, the human race would have been relegated to a worker drone status, serving the needs of a viral queen who could control them through pheromones and biological signals. This was a silent apocalypse that would have replaced our civilization with a mindless and efficient colony. Furthermore, the T. veronica virus proved that the environment itself could be turned into a weapon of total control. The virus created massive tentacles and fungal growths that could reshape the landscape to suit the needs of the hive. This was a threat that went beyond simple infection. It was an architectural restructuring of life itself. We were saved from this global colony only by the narrow timing of the facility's self-destruction and the intervention of Chris and Claire Redfield. If the Ashford twins had been given just a few more days to stabilize the virus and launch their expansion, the T. veronica hive would have become an unstoppable force that would have consumed the world starting from its most isolated corners. It was a close call that showed that even the ends of the earth are not far enough away to protect us from the reach of the viral elite. The Antarctic facility collapse was a warning that the next threat would not necessarily be loud or obvious. The T. veronica virus was a sophisticated and elegant extinction engine that targeted the very structure of our society. It proved that the goal of the bioweapon designers had shifted from simple killing to total species replacement. The Arctic facility was the scale model for a world where the iron will of a single individual could override the freedom of 7 billion people. We survived the T. veronica threat, but we were left with the knowledge that the Earth's most remote locations were being used to brew our destruction. It was a close call that proved that in the age of bioengineering, there is no such thing as a distant threat. Every lab on the planet is a potential ground zero for the end of the world. Part 6, Alexia Ashford, Viral Ascension. The events of 1998 were not confined to the burning streets of Raccoon City. They extended to the most isolated reaches of the planet, where the Ashford family was preparing to unveil a global ecological takeover that would have rendered human civilization a relic of the past. Alexia Ashford was not merely a scientist, she was a self-proclaimed deity who viewed the T. veronica virus as the medium through which she would pollinate the entire world. Her awakening after 15 years of cryogenic stasis was not just a personal return, but a global ecological threat of the highest order. The iron logic of her plan was based on the social structure of an ant colony, where she would serve as the singular queen, and the rest of the biological world would be her drones. This was a vision of extinction that did not rely on simple death, but on the total replacement of the existing food chain with a hierarchy based on the T. veronica DNA. The threat posed by Alexia Ashford was unique because her virus allowed her to control biological life through pheromones and high-temperature fire-based mutations. Had she reached her full potential and escaped the Antarctic facility, she intended to initiate a global expansion that would have turned the Earth into a massive hive. The sorrow of this ascension was the realization that the human race would not have been wiped out in a single explosion, but would have been slowly transformed into mindless workers for a viral hive mind. The T. veronica virus had the ability to rewrite the ecosystem at a fundamental level, turning forests into fungal breeding grounds and animals into predatory protectors of the hive. We were saved from this fate by a matter of narrow timing. If Alexia had been allowed to stabilize her power for even a few more weeks, her influence would have become an unstoppable biological wave that would have moved across the oceans and consumed every continent. Furthermore, the Ashford ascension proved that the greatest threat to humanity is an individual who believes they have outgrown their species. Alexia viewed the 7 billion people on Earth as a chaotic and inefficient mess that needed to be organized under her iron will. Her defeat was not just a victory for the Redfield siblings, but a victory for the concept of human autonomy. If she had succeeded, the very definition of a human being would have been lost, replaced by a drone that lived and died at the whim of its queen. The T. Veronica virus remains one of the most sophisticated extinction engines ever devised, because it targeted the social and biological structure of the planet simultaneously. It was a close call that showed how easily a single brilliant mind can turn the source of all life into a tool for global enslavement. The world nearly ended in 1998 because one woman decided that she was the only person who deserved to be free. The scale of the T. Veronica threat also highlighted the vulnerability of the global environment to a coordinated biological attack. Alexia's ability to manipulate the flora and fauna meant that she could have collapsed the global agricultural system in a matter of months, forcing the starving survivors to turn to the hive for sustenance and protection. This was a strategic brilliance that surpassed the simple destruction of the T virus. It was a plan for a new world order where the Queen was the only source of survival. We survived this era only because the Ashford legacy was as fragile as the ego of its creators. Alexia was defeated before she could spread her wings, but the shadow of her hive remains a warning that the next global threat may not seek to kill us, but to own us forever. Part 7. Wesker, Early Uroboros Vision. Even before the catastrophic events of the 2009 Kajuju incident, Albert Wesker was already meticulously constructing the foundation for what he called total global saturation. To understand why the world almost ended at the hands of Wesker, one must recognize that he was the ultimate architect of extinction. His vision was not born of madness, but of a cold and clinical belief in a viral aristocracy. Wesker had spent years positioning himself within the highest levels of the United States government, the STARS organization, and eventually the BSAA, ensuring that when he finally launched his plan, there would be no institutional resistance left to stop him. His early work with a refined progenitor strain was the precursor to the Uroboros virus, a pathogen designed to systematically select the world's elite while discarding the rest of the human race as biological waste. The iron logic of Wesker's vision was its global scale from the very beginning. He did not care about local outbreaks or tactical weapons. He wanted a planetary reset. He understood that the only way to achieve true godhood was to control the environment on a global level. By the mid-2000s, Wesker had secured the resources of the Tricell Corporation and had gained access to the ancient progenitor ruins in Africa, allowing him to begin the final phase of his research. The sorrow of the Wesker era was the absolute certainty with which he prepared for the end of the world. He viewed the billions of human lives as mere data points in an equation that only he could solve. His early Uroboros vision was a plan for a selective extinction where only the 1 in 10 million who were genetically compatible would survive to serve in his new world. This was a cold and calculated genocide that utilized the language of evolution to justify its cruelty. Wesker nearly succeeded because he possessed the intelligence of a scientist, the resources of a global CEO, and the supernatural power of the progenitor legacy itself. He was the perfect predator moving through the halls of power as a ghost, while preparing the atmosphere for a viral release that would have reached every corner of the Earth. If Wesker had managed to launch his bomber jet in 2009, the human story would have been reset to year zero in a matter of hours. The Uroboros virus would have consumed 99% of the population, turning them into mindless masses of black tendrils, while the selected few were left to inherit a graveyard. We were saved only by the persistent intervention of Chris Redfield and Jill Valentine, who had been tracking Wesker's shadow for over a decade. It was a close call that proved that the world is often held together by the efforts of a few individuals who refuse to blink in the face of a god. Furthermore, Wesker's plan revealed the terrifying ease with which the global infrastructure can be turned into a delivery system for extinction. He used the very companies and agencies meant to protect the world to brew its destruction. This was the ultimate betrayal of the social contract, showing that as long as individuals like Wesker exist, the world will always be one viral strain away from total erasure. The early Uroboros vision was a warning that the next extinction event would be professional, organized, and perfectly executed. Wesker did not fail because his plan was flawed. He failed because he underestimated the iron will of those who still believed in the value of a single human life. He was the most dangerous man to ever live because he was the only one who truly understood that to rule the world, you must first be willing to kill it. Part 8. Las Plagas, Global Control Threat. The 2004 Las Plagas incident in a remote region of Spain introduced a new and subversive type of apocalypse that differed fundamentally from the zombie outbreaks of the previous decade. This was not an extinction event defined by the dead walking the earth, but by the living losing their autonomy. The Las Plagas parasite offered a form of biological puppetry, where the host retained their intelligence, their motor skills, and their ability to follow complex tactical orders, while their individual will was entirely suppressed. The threat was what researchers called the silent takeover. Unlike a viral outbreak, which is loud and chaotic, the Plaga infection could be spread quietly and systematically through the food chain or direct injection. The ultimate goal of the Los Illuminados cult, led by Osmond Sadler, was to infect the daughter of the United States president, and then the president himself, thereby subverting the most powerful government on earth from the inside out. The iron reality of the Las Plagas threat was that it would have ended human freedom without firing a single shot. If Sadler had succeeded in his plan, the world would have woken up one day to find that its leaders were no longer human, but were hosts for a parasitic hive mind. The Ganados were capable of using weapons, driving vehicles, and maintaining a society showing that the parasite could preserve the infrastructure of civilization while replacing the soul of the species. The sorrow of this incident was the realization that the world could be conquered through a quiet infiltration of the nervous system. We would have become a planet of slaves, serving a master we did not even know existed. The Las Plagas parasite was a more sophisticated extinction engine because it did not destroy the world, it simply stole it. Furthermore, the Las Plagas threat highlighted the vulnerability of modern political systems to biological manipulation. Sadler understood that you do not need to kill an army if you can control the man who gives the orders. This was a strategic move toward a geopolitical apocalypse, where the bioweapon was used as a tool for political domination rather than mass slaughter. We were saved from this silent end only by the intervention of Leon S. Kennedy, who managed to dismantle the cult's infrastructure and eliminate the master parasite before the infection could reach the high-level targets in Washington. It was a close call that showed that the next extinction event might not look like a disaster, but like a normal day, where everyone simply stops saying no. The Las Plagas incident remains a chilling reminder that the most effective way to end the world is to take it over from within the minds of those who lead it. The religious and social structure of the Los Iluminados cult also provided a blueprint for how a biological threat can be masked by ideology. Sadler used the parasite to enforce a fanatical loyalty that was deeper than any political or military bond. This made the infected population a cohesive and terrifying force that was nearly impossible to break through conventional means. The world almost ended in 2004 because we were looking for zombies, while the real monsters were wearing the faces of our neighbors and preparing to take our seats at the table. The Las Plagas threat proved that intelligence is the most dangerous variable in a biological war, and it set the stage for the more complex and nihilistic threats of the next 20 years. Part 9. Sadler, Religious Expansion Plan. Lord Osmond Sadler was the first of the post-Umbrella era villains to realize that faith was a more effective infection vector than fear. By framing the Las Plagas transformation as a religious blessing known as the Holy Gift, he ensured that his victims would not fight the parasite, but would instead invite it into their bodies. This religious expansion plan was the engine behind the Los Iluminados cult, and it made the outbreak nearly impossible to stop using conventional military force. When the monsters believe they are holy martyrs, they fight with a fanatical intensity that cannot be broken by traditional combat. Sadler was not just a bioweapon dealer. He was a prophet of a new parasitic age who understood that to control the body, you must first capture the mind. The iron logic of the religious expansion was its ability to create a stable and sustainable infected population. Unlike the T virus, which resulted in a rotting and dying host, the Plaga parasite allowed for a functioning society of infected individuals who could work the fields, maintain the weapons, and recruit new followers. The sorrow of the Spanish village was the total erasure of a centuries-old culture, replaced by the dark and violent liturgy of the cult. Sadler's plan involved expanding this religious model to other parts of the world, using the chaos of the modern era to offer the parasite as a form of divine security and unity. This was a vision of a global religious state where the master Plaga was the god and all of humanity were the worshippers. The world came dangerously close to this reality because we are a species that is hardwired to seek meaning in our suffering, and Sadler offered a biological answer to that search. The religious expansion also provided a perfect cover for the movement of the parasite across international borders. Members of the cult could travel as missionaries or refugees, carrying the infection into new territories under the guise of religious freedom. This was a strategic brilliance that anticipated the decentralization of modern bioterrorism. If Sadler had not been stopped on his island, the Las Plagas would have spread through the world's major religions and social organizations, creating a global network of infected hosts that would have been invisible to the authorities until it was too late to act. The world nearly ended in 2004 because we did not recognize that a prayer could be a delivery system for a parasite. Sadler proved that the most dangerous weapon is the one that tells the victim they are being saved. Furthermore, the religious indoctrination made the infected hosts immune to the psychological trauma of their transformation. They did not see their mutations as horrific, but as signs of divine favor. This allowed them to maintain a high level of function and morale, even in the face of extreme physical change. Sadler's plan was a failure of the human spirit, as much as it was a failure of biological containment, showing that our need for belief can be turned into an iron cage. We survived this era only because the cult's leadership was decapitated before the expansion could move into its global phase. But the template for religious bioterrorism had been set. Sadler was a warning that the next apocalypse might arrive with a smile and a promise of eternal life, while the parasite is already reaching for your spine. Part 10. Terragrigia Panic Incident. In the year 2004, the world witnessed the Terragrigia Panic, an event that redefined the scale of bioterrorism and proved that a single bio-attack could force a superpower to destroy its own city. The floating city of Terragrigia, a marvel of sustainable technology and modern architecture, was decimated by the terrorist group Il Veltro, using the T-Abyss virus. This was the first time that mass panic was weaponized as a primary delivery system for an infection. By releasing the virus into a highly concentrated urban environment and simultaneously disabling the city's defenses, Il Veltro created a state of total chaos that prevented any organized evacuation or containment. The iron reality of Terragrigia was that the city was lost the moment the first canister was opened, and the world watched in horror as a symbol of human progress was turned into a viral tomb. The Terragrigia Panic was a geopolitical extinction event because it forced the Federal Biohazard Commission to use the Regia Solis satellite to incinerate the city to prevent the T-Abyss virus from spreading into the Mediterranean Sea. This was a strategic masterstroke by the terrorists, as it showed that bioweapons could be used to force a government into committing an atrocity against its own people. The sorrow of Terragrigia was the thousands of innocent citizens who were caught between the viral monsters and the orbital laser of their own protectors. This incident nearly triggered a global ecological disaster, as the T-Abyss virus was specifically designed to function in marine environments. If the virus had reached the global currents before the city was destroyed, it would have initiated a collapse of the marine food chain and turned the oceans into a toxic soup of mutated biomass. The use of mass panic as a weapon also proved that our modern society is extremely fragile when faced with a biological threat. The rapid collapse of Terragrigia showed that even the most advanced city can be dismantled in a matter of hours if the population is driven to madness by fear and infection. This was a lesson that the world's governments failed to heed, leading to the even larger disasters of the next decade. Terragrigia was a warning that bioterrorism was moving into an era of open warfare where the goal was not just to kill, but to break the very will of the civilization. We survived the T-Abyss threat only through the extreme and violent sanitization of the city, but the scars of Terragrigia remain a permanent part of the geopolitical landscape. The T-Abyss virus represented a unique threat to the Earth's oceans, the source of all life. If the virus had entered the deep sea currents, it would have mutated marine life into horrific predatory forms and made the world's coastlines uninhabitable. This would have led to a global famine and the total collapse of international trade. Terragrigia was the closest we came to a marine-based extinction event, and it showed that we have no defenses against a pathogen that thrives in the water. The panic incident was a close call that proved that in the age of bioengineering, no city is an island, and no ocean is a barrier. We survived Terragrigia, but we lost a piece of our future, and we were left with the knowledge that our own technology can be used to burn us to the ground in the name of containment. Part 11. The T-Abyss. Ocean Contamination Risk. To understand the true scale of the threat posed by the T-Abyss virus, one must recognize that it was not merely a weapon for urban terror, but a biological reset for the entire planet. While the tragedy of Terragrigia focused on the destruction of a singular floating city, the long-term goal of the research conducted by the Federal Biohazard Commission and the terrorist group Il Veltro was the contamination of the Earth's oceans. The T-Abyss virus was a sophisticated hybrid that combined the T-virus with the DNA of deep-sea fish to create a pathogen that could survive and thrive in the extreme pressures and low temperatures of the abyss. This was a direct attack on the source of all life. If released into the global currents, the virus would have initiated a world-end scenario where the oceans were transformed into a toxic and viral vat, making land-based life impossible within a generation. The iron logic of the T-Abyss threat was the impossibility of containment once the virus reached the open sea. Unlike a terrestrial outbreak, which can be quarantined by the military or sanitized through nuclear fire, an oceanic infection is mobile and invisible. The viral strands would have traveled along the major currents from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic and beyond, infecting every level of the marine food chain, from the smallest plankton to the largest whales. The sorrow of the T-Abyss risk was the realization that the cradle of life was being turned into its grave. As marine life mutated into horrific predatory forms such as the ooze, the global fishing industry would have collapsed, leading to a worldwide famine that would have killed billions long before the virus ever reached the coastlines. This was a plan for a slow and agonizing extinction, where the world's primary resource for food and oxygen was systematically dismantled. Furthermore, the T-Abyss virus proved that human technology is entirely insufficient when faced with a deep-sea biological threat. We have no way to track or neutralize a pathogen that exists thousands of meters below the surface. If the Queen Zenobia and its sister ships had not been neutralized by the BSAA, the T-Abyss would have been released into the deep water channels, where it would have remained for centuries, constantly mutating and re-emerging to haunt the shores. We were saved from this marine apocalypse only by the narrow intervention of Jill Valentine and Chris Redfield, who managed to sink the research vessels before the final payload could be deployed. It was a close call that showed that our survival is dependent on the health of an ecosystem that we have no way to defend against bioengineering. The T-Abyss remains the ultimate warning that when you poison the well, the entire world eventually dies of thirst. The risk also highlighted the terrifying potential for bioweapons to cause a permanent shift in the Earth's climate and atmosphere. The oceans are the primary driver of the planet's weather and oxygen cycles. If the viral biomass of the T-Abyss had reached a critical mass, it would have altered the chemical composition of the water, leading to a collapse of the oxygen-producing algae. This would have resulted in a global asphyxiation event where the air itself became unbreathable. Terragrigia was the first warning of this nightmare, but the true scale of the T-Abyss threat was a planetary suicide. We survived this era by the skin of our teeth, but the oceans remain vulnerable to the next scientist who decides that the abyss is the perfect place to hide a monster. Part 12. The Sea Virus. Global Launch. In the year 2013, the world faced its first multi-front biological war during the simultaneous attacks on tall oaks in the United States and Lanxiang in China. This was the global launch of the Sea Virus, a masterstroke of nihilistic engineering by Carla Radames and the organization known as Neo Umbrella. Unlike previous incidents, which were isolated to a single city or facility, the Sea Virus attacks were designed to trigger a simultaneous apocalypse that would overwhelm the world's emergency responses and military forces. By utilizing high-altitude missiles and localized gas canisters to release the virus in multiple global hubs at once, Neo Umbrella ensured that no nation could send aid to another. This was the industrialization of the Raccoon City concept, moving from the death of a city to the collapse of international civilization in mere days. The iron reality of the C virus launch was the rapid transition of the civilian population into a state of total mutation. The gas form of the virus, known as the blue fog, could convert an entire city block into zombies, or the more advanced Jarvo, in a matter of seconds. This speed meant that the traditional containment protocols of the BSAA and the United States military were rendered obsolete before they could even be deployed. The sorrow of Tall Oaks and Lanxiang was the absolute panic that engulfed the world as people realized that nowhere was safe. International travel and trade were suspended, and the global economy went into a tailspin as the world's superpowers were forced to fire upon their own fleeing citizens to prevent the infection from spreading. This was a vision of a world where the social contract was permanently broken by the threat of the air we breathe. Furthermore, the C virus represented a unique strategic threat because it created the Jarvo soldiers who retained their intelligence and could use advanced weaponry. This meant that the BSAA was not fighting a mindless mob, but a coordinated military force that could adapt and mutate in real time. The simultaneous nature of the attacks meant that the world's defense resources were stretched to the breaking point, leading to the collapse of several local governments. We were saved from a total global failure only by the fractured nature of Neo Umbrella's leadership and the heroic intervention of several key agents who managed to eliminate the source of the gas production. It was a close call that proved that in the age of rapid transit, a biological weapon can move faster than the cure. The C virus was the first time humanity truly stared into the abyss of a global extinction event and found that it was staring back. The C virus also proved that the decentralization of bioterrorism had reached a point where a single disgruntled individual with access to Umbrella's legacy could hold the entire world hostage. Carla Radames was not a corporate leader, but a scientist driven by a personal vendetta, yet she had the power to end human history. This was a chilling revelation for the survivors of the 1998 era. The world almost ended in 2013 because we had not accounted for the fact that the tools of mass destruction were now in the hands of those who had nothing to lose. The C virus launch was the ultimate expression of the open bio-warfare era, showing that the future of humanity is constantly at risk from the vengeful ghosts of our own scientific arrogance. Part 13. Neo Umbrella's Ideological Apocalypse. The threat posed by Carla Radames and Neo Umbrella was fundamentally different from the aristocratic visions of Oswald Spencer or the evolutionary goals of Albert Wesker. Carla's plan was not about money power or the creation of a new world order. It was about absolute chaos and the total destruction of the existing one. This was an ideological apocalypse driven by a sense of profound personal betrayal and a nihilistic desire to see every human institution fail. Because her logic was based on revenge, there was no room for negotiation, no incentive for a cure, and no limit to the suffering she was willing to inflict. The C virus was the most nihilistic extinction threat in history because its only purpose was to turn the world into a graveyard of Jarvo, where the survivors would be trapped in a nightmare of their own making. The iron logic of Carla's plan was the realization that you do not need to rule the world if your goal is to punish it. She designed the C virus to be as chaotic and unpredictable as possible, ensuring that the mutations would be grotesque and agonizing. The Jarvo were not meant to be the soldiers of a new empire. They were meant to be the witnesses to the end of the human soul. The sorrow of the Neo Umbrella era was the complete lack of a constructive vision. While Spencer wanted to be a god, Carla wanted to be the fire that consumed the temple. This made her the most dangerous type of antagonist because she could not be bought or reasoned with. The world nearly ended in 2013 because we were trying to fight a war while she was trying to commit a global suicide. Furthermore, the ideological apocalypse of Neo Umbrella proved that the greatest threat to our survival is the psychological instability of those who possess the secrets of the progenitor legacy. Carla had been manipulated and used as a biological double for Ada Wong, and she turned that trauma into a global weapon. This showed that the history of human experimentation had created a cycle of violence that would eventually consume the entire planet if it was not stopped. We were saved from this total civilization failure only by the intervention of those who still held onto their humanity in the face of absolute horror. It was a close call that showed that the next extinction event might not be born of a desire for power, but of a simple human heart that has been broken one too many times. Neo Umbrella's legacy is the proof that bioweapons are the ultimate tool for the disenfranchised and the vengeful. Carla proved that a single brilliant mind with enough resources can bypass the military and political barriers of the world to strike at the heart of our civilization. The C virus was the manifestation of her rage, and it nearly succeeded in silencing the world forever. This was a failure of the systems we built to manage scientific progress, showing that as long as we treat human beings as disposable material, we will continue to create the very monsters that will destroy us. The ideological apocalypse was the final verdict on the 1990s era of experimentation, proving that the fire we started in Africa would eventually burn every home in Lanshiang and Tall Oaks. Part 14. Uroboros Global Release Plan. The year 2009 stands as the moment the human race came the closest to a total and final reset during Albert Wesker's attempt to release the Uroboros virus into the Earth's atmosphere. This was the Judgment Day event that Wesker had been preparing for since the 1960s. Uroboros was a highly refined and aggressive pathogen designed to achieve what the raw Progenitor Virus could not: the systematic selection of the superior human specimens on a global scale. Wesker intended to launch a high-altitude bomber jet from a massive volcano in Africa and release the virus into the global wind currents, ensuring that every living person on the planet would be exposed within a matter of hours. This was not a local outbreak. It was a planetary trial by fire. The iron reality of the Uroboros plan was its absolute brutality. The virus was designed to consume 99% of the human population, turning those who were genetically incompatible into mindless masses of black tendrils known as Uroboros creatures. These beings would then consume the remaining biomass until nothing was left, but a dead world inhabited by a few 100,000 superior humans who would serve as the foundation for Wesker's New World Order. The sorrow of this plan was the cold efficiency with which Wesker viewed the extinction of his own species. He viewed the 7 billion people on Earth as a failed experiment that needed to be terminated to allow for a more refined version of life to emerge. This remains the closest the human race has ever come to a complete erasure of its history and its future. Furthermore, Wesker nearly succeeded because he had positioned himself perfectly to avoid any resistance. He controlled the resources of the Tri-Cell Corporation and had successfully infiltrated the BSAA, ensuring that he was always 10 steps ahead of those who were trying to stop him. He had the intelligence of the world's greatest scientist, the financial backing of a global pharmaceutical titan, and the supernatural strength of a god. We were saved from this judgment day only by the unrelenting pursuit of Chris Redfield and Shaver Alamar, who managed to board the bomber jet and engage Wesker in a final confrontation within the heart of a volcano. It was a close call that proved that the fate of the world often rests on the shoulders of a few individuals who are willing to walk through hell to stop a madman. Uroboros was the ultimate expression of the umbrella philosophy taken to its logical and horrific conclusion. It was the realization of Oswald Spencer's dream, but executed with the clinical precision of Albert Wesker. The world almost ended in 2009 because we had allowed a single man to accumulate too much knowledge and too much power. Uroboros was a biological judge and jury, and its verdict was death for the majority of the human race. We survived this final reset, but we were left with the knowledge that the atmosphere itself can be turned into a weapon against us. Wesker's plan was a failure of the highest order, but it was also a masterpiece of extinction engineering that showed that the human race is only one flight away from its own extinction. Part 15, Why Wesker almost succeeded to analyze the history of Albert Wesker is to analyze why the human race nearly met its end at the hands of its own creation. Wesker nearly succeeded in his Uroboros plan because he was the perfect architect of extinction. He possessed a unique combination of attributes that made him more dangerous than any villain who had come before him. He had the intelligence of a first-class researcher, allowing him to understand the deepest secrets of the progenitor legacy. He had the corporate resources of Trisul and the intelligence networks of the BSAA, allowing him to operate in total secrecy while manipulating the global response to bioterrorism. And perhaps most importantly, he possessed the god-like power of the virus itself within his own body, giving him the physical ability to crush anyone who stood in his way. The iron logic of Wesker's success was his ability to use the world's own defenses against itself. He understood that the best way to destroy an institution is to lead it. By positioning himself as a key figure in the fight against biohazards, he was able to gather data and resources that were intended to save the world and use them to brew its destruction. The sorrow of the Wesker era was the absolute betrayal of the human trust. He was the man the world looked to for protection, while he was secretly preparing the missiles that would end it. This was a strategic brilliance that surpassed the simple malice of a terrorist. Wesker was a predator who had learned how to wear the skin of his prey, and he used that deception to bring the world to the very edge of the abyss. Furthermore, Wesker succeeded because he was entirely free from the human emotions that usually act as a barrier to total genocide. He did not feel guilt, empathy, or fear. He viewed the extinction of the human race as a simple biological necessity, a required step in the evolution of the species. This psychological detachment allowed him to execute his plan with a clinical focus that was terrifying to behold. He did not want to rule through fear. He wanted to rule through the absolute authority of the superior organism. We survived only because Wesker's arrogance led him to believe that he was truly untouchable. His obsession with his rivalry with Chris Redfield created the only opening that allowed for his defeat. It was a narrow margin of victory for the human race, proving that our survival is often a matter of the smallest human flaws in the minds of our monsters. The legacy of Albert Wesker is the realization that the greatest threat to humanity is not a virus, but a man who has become one. Wesker was the ultimate product of the Umbrella era, a human being who had been refined into a weapon of mass destruction. He showed that when you merge the human intellect with the viral power of the progenitor legacy, you create a being that is fundamentally incompatible with the existing world. Wesker nearly succeeded because he was the future he was trying to build, and he saw no reason why the past should be allowed to survive. He was the perfect architect of extinction, and his story remains the definitive warning about the dangers of the genetic godhood attempts that continue to haunt the world of 2026. Part 16. The mold, silent, global spread risk. The discovery of the mutamycete, or what is commonly known as the mold, in 2017 represented a fundamental shift in the nature of the global extinction threat. Unlike the T virus, which announced its presence through the loud and visible horror of The Walking Dead, the mold was a silent pandemic. The iron logic of this fungal organism was based on subversion rather than destruction. The mold does not simply kill the host. It replaces the human tissue with a complex fungal colony that can mimic the appearance and the memories of the original person. The threat to the world was a silent takeover, where every home, every city, and every government could be replaced by a singular fungal hive mind controlled by a central mother. This was a vision of a world that looked perfectly normal on the surface, but was actually a hollowed-out shell of biomass serving a prehistoric consciousness. The risk of a silent global spread was exacerbated by the mold's ability to communicate through a psychic or telepathic network. Once a person is infected, they become a node in a global web that allows the central host to monitor their thoughts and control their actions from thousands of miles away. The sorrow of the mold era was the realization that the people you loved could be replaced by fungal mimics without any outward sign of change. In the small town of Dulve, Louisiana, the Baker family became the pilot program for this extinction event. They were transformed into a pack of regenerative predators who maintained a mask of domestic normalcy to lure in new victims. If the mold had reached a major transportation hub, it would have spread through the population like an invisible mist, turning the entire human race into a colony of the mutamycete. Furthermore, the mold proved to be far more resilient than any viral pathogen developed by Umbrella. Because it is a fungal organism, it can survive in the soil, the water, and the air for decades, waiting for a host to come into contact with it. This made the threat of a global infection nearly impossible to detect through standard medical screening. We were saved from this silent end only by the intervention of Ethan Winters and the specialized tactical teams of the Blue Umbrella organization, who managed to isolate the primary source of the infection. It was a close call that showed that the next extinction event might not come with a roar, but with a whisper. The mold remains a permanent threat to the world of 2026, because once the spores are in the environment, they can never truly be removed. We are living on a planet that is slowly being reclaimed by a fungal mind that has existed since before the dawn of man. The silent spread also targeted the very concept of the individual. In a molded world, there is no I, only the collective will of the hive. This was the ultimate realization of the hive mind theory, first tested by James Marcus, but on a scale that was planetary. The failure to detect the mold earlier allowed it to grow into a massive underground network that nearly reached a critical mass. It was a close call that proved that our focus on viral outbreaks had left us vulnerable to a more patient and subtle form of biology. The mold did not want to kill us. It wanted to be us, and in many ways, it already is. Part 17. E-Series Mass Production Scenario. The E-Series project, specifically the creation of the subject known as Everline, was the industrialization of the mold threat. Developed by the organization known as the Connections, this program was designed for biological conquest through the mass production of specialized child hosts. The iron ambition of the E-Series was to create a weapon that could infiltrate a society and bring it to its knees through telepathic domination. If the Connections had successfully mass-produced these subjects, they would have had the power to replace the world's governing bodies with molded copies that were entirely under their control. The world would have ended not with a nuclear bang, but with a silent domestic takeover of every home on Earth. This was a strategic move toward a world where the human race was preserved as a resource but stripped of its agency. The failure of the E-series mass production scenario was a matter of narrow tactical intervention. Eveline was a prototype that was prone to psychological instability and hyper-accelerated aging, which made her difficult to control in a field environment. However, the data gathered from the Dulvey incident allowed the connections to refine the project. The sorrow of the E-series was the use of the human desire for family and belonging as a weapon. Eveline did not see herself as a bioweapon. She saw herself as a young girl who wanted a family. This psychological drive made her all the more dangerous because she would stop at nothing to expand her circle of control. If dozens of these E-series subjects had been deployed simultaneously, the world's military and political leaders would have been turned into puppets within a matter of weeks. Furthermore, the E-series proved that the next generation of bioweapons would be designed for occupation rather than destruction. The goal was to maintain the infrastructure of the world while hollowing out the people who inhabited it. This was a sophisticated and terrifying evolution of the umbrella philosophy. We were saved from this mass production nightmare only by the total destruction of the Dulvey facility and the loss of the primary research data. It was a close call that showed that the corporate entities that rose from the ashes of Umbrella were even more nihilistic than their predecessor. They did not want to rule a world of gods. They wanted to manage a world of drones. The E-series was a failure of the human spirit that nearly succeeded in turning the entire planet into a nursery for a fungal god. The E-series scenario also highlighted the danger of using biological weapons to target the domestic sphere. By infecting families and using homes as laboratories, the E-series was able to bypass the traditional defenses of the state. This was a total war on the human identity. The world almost ended in 2017 because we were looking for an army on the border while the enemy was already sitting at our dinner table. The E-series remains the definitive example of how the next extinction event will be personal, quiet, and absolute. Part 18. Why the world survived every time. In the cold and clinical history of these near-extinction events, we must ask why the human race still exists in 2026. The answer is not found in the strength of our governments or the efficiency of our militaries, but in a combination of profound luck and the resistance of a handful of individuals. Every time the world reached the edge of the abyss, it was pushed back by people like Chris Redfield, Leon Kennedy, Jill Valentine, and Claire Redfield. These individuals acted as the biological and tactical fail-safes of the species. Their unique genetic resistance, their specialized training, and their absolute refusal to surrender are the only reasons the human story did not end in Raccoon City or on the decks of a tri-cell tanker. We have survived through the intervention of a few who were willing to become as monstrous as their enemies to save the world. The iron reality of our survival is that it is statistically impossible. According to the data gathered by Umbrella and the BSAA, the world should have ended at least 14 times in the last 30 years. The fact that it hasn't is a testament to the chaotic and unpredictable nature of the human will. Luck played a massive role. A delayed flight, a failed injection, or a jammed door was often the only difference between a localized incident and a global catastrophe. The sorrow of our survival is the realization that we are living on borrowed time. We have relied on the heroism of a few to compensate for the systemic failures of the many. Our survival is a fragile miracle that has been bought with the blood of thousands of STARS agents and BSAA soldiers who did not make it home. Furthermore, the world survived because the bioweapons themselves were often too efficient for their own good. Pathogens like the T virus and the C virus were so aggressive that they often burned through their host populations before they could reach a critical mass for global transmission. The arrogance of the creators often led them to build weapons that were strategically unsound. They wanted to kill everyone, and in doing so, they often left themselves with no way to spread the infection further. We survived because the monsters we created were as flawed as we are. However, this is a narrow margin of safety. As bioweapons become more stable and more sophisticated, the luck that has protected us for decades will eventually run out. The survival of the world is also a result of the human ability to adapt and unify in the face of absolute horror. The formation of the BSAA and the international agreements on biohazard containment proved that we can work together when our extinction is on the line. But this unity is always reactive. We only act after the city is burning. This pattern of survival is not a strategy. It is a desperate scramble for the exit. We have survived every time, but each victory has left us weaker and more traumatized. The fail-safes are tired, and the world is more unstable than ever before. Our history is a record of narrow escapes, proving that we are not the masters of our destiny, but the lucky survivors of our own stupidity. Part 19. Patterns across every near-extinction event. When we look back at the 30-year history of near-extinction events, we see a clinical and repetitive pattern that defines the human condition. Every disaster from the 1960s to the present day follows the same arc of human arrogance. It begins with the belief that a single individual or organization is special enough to control the forces of evolution. From Oswald Spencer to Albert Wesker to Mother Miranda, the villains of this history all shared the same iron delusion, that they could start a fire and not be burned by it. They viewed the human race as a failed experiment, and themselves as the chosen architects of its replacement. This pattern of elitist madness is the primary driver of every extinction event, showing that the greatest threat to our survival is our own ego. The second pattern is the consistent failure of containment. In every instance, the organization responsible for the bioweapon believed they had perfect control over their creation. They built their labs in the most isolated corners of the world and used the most advanced technology to secure them, yet they were always undone by a single human error or an unpredictable mutation. This pattern proves that you cannot weaponize life without eventually losing control of it. The sorrow of this history is the repetition of the same mistakes. We nuked Raccoon City, and then we built a floating city in the Mediterranean that was even more vulnerable. We defeated the T virus, and then we created the C virus, which was 10 times more lethal. We never learn. We only upgrade our disasters. The third pattern is the tactical reliance on a few exceptional individuals to clean up the mess. The world has created a cycle where the many are endangered by the few and then saved by the even fewer. This creates a state of permanent instability where the global population is entirely dependent on the survival of a handful of agents. This pattern is unsustainable. We are treating the end of the world like a manageable risk because we assume there will always be a Redfield or a Kennedy to pull the plug at the last second. This is a cognitive bias that will eventually lead to our total failure. The patterns of near extinction are the warnings that the world has ignored for decades a record of a species that is addicted to the very fire that is consuming it. Finally, every extinction event proves that the bioweapon is a mirror of its creator. The T-virus reflected the cold corporate cruelty of Umbrella. The Las Plagas reflected the fanatical desire for control of the Los Iluminados. The C-virus reflected the nihilistic rage of Carla Radames. We are not being attacked by monsters from outer space. We are being attacked by our own darkest impulses given biological form. The pattern is clear. As long as we continue to seek power through the destruction of others, we will continue to brew the end of the world. The next near-extinction event is already following this pattern, waiting for the right moment to remind us that we have learned nothing. Part 20. The next collapse is not fiction. In the year 2026, we stand at a precipice. The world of Resident Evil is more unstable than it has ever been. The collapse of the major pharmaceutical titans like Umbrella and Tricell did not end the threat. It merely decentralized it. The secrets of the Progenitor legacy are now scattered across the global black market, available to anyone with enough money and a dark enough vision. The next collapse is not a fictional scenario, but a statistical certainty. We are living in a world where the next global extinction event is already being brewed in a basement in a third world capital, or in a secret lab hidden beneath a legitimate hospital. The industrialization of bioterrorism has reached a point where the barrier to entry is lower than it has ever been, and the potential for destruction is infinite. The iron reality of the 2026 landscape is the lack of a centralized authority to manage the threat. The BSAA has become fragmented and prone to corruption, and the international community is more divided than ever. We have lost the unity that allowed us to survive the C-virus and the Uroboros threats. This decentralization means that the next outbreak will likely be simultaneous and impossible to track. The sorrow of our current era is the complacency that has set in, because it has been a few years since the last major urban collapse. The world believes that the danger has passed, but the viruses do not sleep. They are in the soil, they are in the water, and they are in the labs of the next generation of madmen who believe they can do what Wesker could not. The next collapse will likely be a total species replacement event. The focus of modern bioengineering has shifted away from simple killing and toward the permanent modification of the human genome. We are looking at a future where the human race is not wiped out, but is slowly edited out of existence, replaced by a more obedient and resilient version of life. This is the ultimate victory for the Umbrella ideology. We survived the explosions and the monsters, only to face a silent and molecular end. Raccoon City was a warning that the world still hasn't heeded. You cannot weaponize life without eventually losing your own. We are the architects of our own obsolescence, and the clock is ticking. The final verdict on the history of near extinction is that we are a species that has outpaced its own morality. We have the power of gods and the wisdom of children. The world almost ended 20 times in the last 30 years, and each time we were given a chance to change our path. We chose to keep building the fire. The next collapse will be the final one because we have run out of heroes and we have run out of luck. The only question that remains is whether we will be the ones to witness the end or if we will be the ones who trigger it. The world of 2026 is a graveyard waiting for its first resident, and the silence is the only thing we have left to listen to. Thank you for watching this video. Good night.